let's talk about the title of today's video.
Yes.
The HDMI Forum, the organization responsible for development of the HDMI specification, has rejected AMD's request to add HDMI 2.1 Plus support to its open source Linux graphics driver. That's right, folks. For the last 3 years, GNU/Linux users with AMD GPUs have not had support for 4K at 120 Hz through HDMI 2.1 because the HDMI Forum restricted public access to its specifications in 2021. So only licensed manufacturers that pay both annual fees and royalties are allowed to have access to the newest specifications. Now, AMD, right?
Clearly.
A licensed manufacturer had their legal team and Linux engineers work for months to devise a way to implement HDMI 2.1 Plus support in their open source driver without exposing the now private specs.
Very honorable.
But the forum still denied AMD's request to open source for the open source driver support.
Very dishonorable.
Really?
Very annoying. Actually, super annoying.
Can HDMI off already?
Oh, I wish.
To be clear, there are things that I like about it. There are things that are very good about HDMI, but I feel like they're kind of resting on the most important thing about HDMI, which is its ubiquity at this point, rather than
extremely recognizable name.
Rather than making HDMI just better to use. Like, remember why we create standards for the users? No, that's not why we do it at all, is it?
That can't be why. We create standards to unify the current existing pool of too many standards. We make one more standard that's better than all the rest of the standards.
And then if we have the best standard, we make money.
Yeah.
So there's a note from Jacob here. Intel's Arc A700 cards get around this problem because Intel and some of their AIBs add a protocol converter chip to the card to translate DisplayPort signals from the GPU into HDMI 2.1 signals.
Which is insane.
Shouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, that's crazy. And you're paying for that.
And
by the way.
you are paying for that. It adds cost to the board because... Yeah. Okay, this is an assumption. I would assume every HDMI output on that board would have to have one of those as opposed to...
Even if there only had to be one, you're still paying for it.
It would be a higher complexity one, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. The only thing that's frustrating about this is that I often like HDMI just because I find it easier. Some DisplayPort plug, like they're actually really annoying to unplug mostly, but plug in as well.
Kind of a pain in the butt.
The clamp connector thing doesn't really seem great.
You can get ones that don't have the lock on it. They just kind of click in, and then if you pull them hard enough, they come out. Dell's been shipping those by default with their monitors for quite a lot of years now.
Okay.
But my biggest issue with DisplayPort is that sometimes its auto handshaking can be a little shaky.
That too.
As you'll have a system that is on. You will plug. You'll go from HDMI. You'll unplug HDMI. You'll plug in DisplayPort, and it'll be like,
huh?
I don't even think it says huh. It just does nothing.
Nothing here.
Display stays black. You plug the HDMI back in, it works. And you reboot the thing, and the DisplayPort works. Like, it can just be it can struggle a little sometimes.
I find DisplayPort also has significantly more issues with the monitor randomly goes black problem. Mm-hmm. Which is super annoying. Very annoying to diagnose.
Yep. So our discussion questions here are, why do you think the forum made this decision? I mean, I think we could kind of come up with some good reasons for it. You know, we could say, well, they want to maintain consistency in that experience. And in order to do that, you have to have everyone who's implementing the standard contributing monetarily to the standard to ensure that they can continue to develop the standard. I mean, look, I'm making a devil's advocate argument, and it's not a stupid one.
They are AMD licensed manufacturer. They are, though.
They are a licensed manufacturer, sure, but what they are effectively potentially opening up the pathway to is the potential for someone to implement the standard by kind of reverse engineering it from this open source implementation.
Yeah. Reverse engineering is specifically the thing I was going to lean
That's
into.
the thing that they're afraid of. But then I'm sitting here going, okay, but then, AMD and Linux developers went and they put a bunch of work, they put a bunch of time into keeping the proprietary elements of the HDMI implementation separate from the open source part of that driver. But then, okay, hold on a second. Let's say you're Luke.
Oh.
Okay.
Big assumption.
Yeah, you're kind of, the project lead of like an online video platform.
Okay.
Let's call it for the sake of argument, Float Plane. I know it's a stupid name,
Weird
but
name.
yeah, weird name.
Makes no sense.
Yeah, but let's just
look into that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. The point is we'll call it that. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Someday you'll have a budget for a marketing department and they'll figure out a new one.
I don't know about that.
Probably never.
Yeah.
The point is that you're this guy.
Okay.
And someone comes to you and they say, hey, your DRM, okay, for that prevents non-paying customers from using your thing. We found a way for people to use your thing on this like unsupported device by kind of integrating your DRM in a way that like we've done that makes it so that, they can't reverse engineer your DRM, but you told us how it worked. And so we kind of put it in there and the rest of it's open source, but that's like really separate. Cool, right?
Maybe.
Probably a lot of work for you to go in and figure out if you did it right.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So I understand the perspective, but I am not happy about it.
Yeah.
And as generally someone who is supportive of things working as well as they can, someone bought your product.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't...
Someone bought your product.
I think was pretty good, but...
It wasn't perfect.
It wasn't perfect.
But
especially
the point was
because these people already were able to use HDMI up until this spec. So it's more that it was taken away, kind of.
And so
I understand
think,
there's a new purchase involved in this scenario.
I think for me, if the HDMI implementers forum, if the HDMI forum, sorry, I can never remember all the names of these forums. If the HDMI forum wanted to reach out to our inbox and say, okay, look, here was the problem. We had all of these devices that had this like reverse engineered HDMI 2.0 and they weren't paying royalties, and it was turning out that the implementation wasn't very good, it wasn't up to standard, and we were getting a lot of complaints. Like if you can provide me with some kind of documentation that demonstrates that this was necessary, that it was necessary to close this off because people weren't paying their fair share and it was somehow harming the development of the standard and harming the user, then, all right. I would at least be willing to hear that argument, but I'm having a really hard time right now knowing that HDMI is already one of the most expensive port standards to implement. In fact, I'm not aware of one that costs more. Maybe something from Apple. Maybe Apple's licensing for MagSafe or Lightning would be higher than HDMI.
I've heard Lightning is pretty rough.
I'm legitimately not sure. I don't know exactly what they are for either of them. I know that HDMI's is quite a burden on device manufacturers. And I know that is compared to things like USB, things like category. I don't know what to call it. Whatever fits into an RJ45 port, all right? If I call it Ethernet, people get mad.
Hey.
Because Ethernet, it could run over any physical... I know, but if I say Ethernet, do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. The point is that on a PC or on a piece of home theater equipment or something like that, I can't think, Toslink, like I can't think of any other interface that has the same kind of costs associated with it. So you're already charging a lot. You're already reaping enormous revenues from the implementations of your standards. So can you just calm the fuck down?
No. We must be chaos. I don't want peace. I want problems. There's the whole vote with your wallet question. But in the discussion questions, it says, in a tweet about the forum's decision, Wendell, hi Wendell, Wendell's great, from Level 1 Tech said, to vote with your wallets. How can consumers avoid supporting the HDMI forum when they are essentially paying for HDMI license fees whenever they buy a device that has an HDMI port? I would say that they're probably also paying for HDMI licensing fees whenever you buy a cable.
You're paying HDMI, not necessarily.
It
depends. We have looked into cables.
Okay.
While we haven't looked into port implementations, we have looked into cable implementations because, as you may or may not know, in the background we've been working on cables.
Yeah.
Really good ones, by the way. And the way that it typically works is, as long as you, because the connector's the connector. Okay. So as long as you have good conductors in a good configuration with good twists and good insulation and shielding, right? A cable is just a cable, and nobody can tell you can't make that physical cable. In the case of...
This is not official documentation.
In the case of HDMI and USB-C, I can tell you that much.
Okay.
But what they can say is you may not put HDMI...
yes, on the box or whatever.
Logos and emblems and...
You can make no claims.
Yeah, so these things are trademarked, right? And I'm sure Tynan's going to jump in and sort of clarify some of this if he's in Floatplane chat right now. But the point is that you can pretty much anyone can make a cable, and they're unlikely to get into any kind of trouble unless they violate a trademark, like USB Type-C Super Speed Ultra Extra XL, right? Or whatever they're calling crap these days. But where was I going with this? As for how to get around supporting them, then no, there's pretty much nothing that you can do.
Yeah. If you do stop using it, if you stop buying HDMI cables, I think that will make a difference, genuinely. Because if device manufacturers are like, no one's using HDMI. Right,
that's what I was saying. No, I don't think it will make a difference because
included in the box?
My understanding is that the fees are on the device side. They're not on the cable side necessarily.
No, but what I'm saying is if you stop buying HDMI cables, manufacturers might stop including it.
How would they even know?
Oh, I'm sure they know.
I'm BenQ. How do I know that people are plugged in via DisplayPort to my monitor? I don't think I do. And on the like home theater side of things, on the multimedia side of things, it's not like I have a choice. I can't use DisplayPort on anything, on any TV. I've not really understood this. When NVIDIA launched their BFGD initiative, their big fucking display technology, or gaming display. That's what it was short for.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't make the rules. But when NVIDIA launched that, I was like, heck yeah. One of the things that I hope gains momentum is DisplayPort. Mm-hmm. Because honestly, everything that I would need for a TV, DisplayPort can do, and it's royalty free. So let's go. What are we waiting for? But the intercompatibility, I'm like someone had to get it started was kind of my mindset. And if we start getting TVs that have it, if every TV just has one of these ports on it, well, hey, that's a starting point. In time, maybe we start to get devices that have both interfaces, kind of like we've seen HDMI make its way onto PCs. It used to be that PCs were just VGA, and then VGA and DVI, and then just DVI for the most part, although you'd use VGA for your legacy monitors, or you'd use the analog pins on the DVI connector for that. And then all of a sudden HDMI showed up. And the question at the time especially was, why? It was smaller, so that was a dubious benefit. But the HDMI standard we were using, I guess it would have been 1.1, 1.2, whatever it was at the time that it started becoming more ubiquitous on PC monitors, was bandwidth equivalent to DVI. So there was no compelling reason other than, I guess you like spending a little bit more on your monitor. Like, I just didn't really get it. And then it was part of the big push towards home theater PCs. So I guess that's ultimately the reason why we started to see it more. But then it's just become this given that HDMI is on graphics cards. And now all of a sudden, okay, now it kind of is on most monitors, and it's just kind of snowballed from there. And I wanted to see something similar to that happen in the home theater space with DisplayPort, and it just hasn't happened at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think market survey stuff would exist. I do think stores would be reporting somewhere that these companies that are making decisions on compatibility would be able to have that information for the fact that, not the fact that, but in this theoretical scenario where DisplayPort is outselling HDMI by a significant degree, and then adjustments would be made. But
I don't think there's anything.
That's a lot to ask from the market, and it will not happen.
It's not happening.
Yes.
It's not happening.
Yeah.
Someone in Twitch chat pointed out that HDMI did have the benefit of carrying audio, while DVI did not. That is true. I don't think it was a huge, meaningful benefit for PCs at the time, but that is a really good point. And then we've got the conspiracy theory reason that popped up in Floatplane chat. That is probably the real reason, and HDMI supported HDCP. So there was enormous industry pressure to make HDMI a standard. Because HDCP has prevented content ripping.
Absolutely. Please continue to think this.
Okay, real talk though. There is something to be said for the hassle of it being more difficult. Like finding an HDCP stripper is kind of a pain in the butt because nobody advertises that functionality, because the second they do, this well-funded group, because of all the royalties they collect, goes after them and makes sure that it, goes away. And so for the average person, like if we're talking like my little brother or something like that, if he could just as easily pirate some piece of content. Okay, let's think back to the R4 for the Nintendo DS.
Okay.
It was brain dead simple to pirate games for that platform, and pretty much everyone I knew did it. They had an R4 cartridge, you put a micro SD in it, and then you just downloaded ROMs, and it was like way better. It was way better than the paid experience because you just had an entire, personal Netflix library of games to play, and you just selected what you wanted and booted it up. It was actually better than carrying around a bunch of carts, which felt stupid.
It's interesting that you went to Netflix over like Steam.
I know, but don't worry about it. Okay. The point is that when piracy is really easy.
I think it still is, though, because you're talking about ripping, so you're talking about the work that would have to be done in order to pirate the thing. I think most people, if they're going to engage in the piracy, they're just going to download it.
Sure,
so it's hurting like the light hobbyists or the tinkerers that would like to do it themselves, and you're actually hurting probably the people that are trying to do it in a more what I think most people would see as a maybe it's not okay with the law, but this is pretty much okay sense, where they buy the thing and then rip it for themselves.
I think that's a very hypothetical person. I don't think too many people are doing that.
That's what I'm saying, though, but I think that's the only people that are basically being affected.
Sure.
Because I don't know how many people are like, oh, I desire to pirate, so I'm going to buy this thing and then give it to other people.
Well, there's a surprising number of, I guess I'll say, like, selfless pirates. Like, there's a lot of Robin Hoods out there, who will go and buy a Blu-ray so that they can rip it and they can upload it to, a private tracker or something like that.
I don't think there's that many, though.
I mean, there's enough.
Yes.
There's enough.
There's definitely enough.
There's more than enough.
Yes.
And,
But I think it's dozens of us. There are dozens of us situation.
And back to my point, though, about how the barrier to entry is measurable. I mean, even getting a membership to a private tracker, which I have done, it's kind of a hassle.
Yeah.
It's a barrier. And if you're downloading off okay, I'm going to use a super outdated reference, but for a good reason. If you're downloading movies from the Pirate Bay, especially with all of the interesting things that have happened with the Pirate Bay name and the Pirate Bay domains over the years.
Yeah, don't do that right now.
that there's inherent risk. And even if you got a copy of a movie from it, say for example, it's probably not going to be that great quality. So what I'm trying to say is that right now, for my little brother, for the Nintendo DS, I'd be like, I don't know, get an R4 and download games, right? If he was asking me how to pirate games. And for something like movies, I would say, I don't feel like coaching you on how to do this safely. Go buy a movie. Subscribe to Netflix.
Get a Blu-ray.
And so there is.
Keep it.
I think that among the hyper techie audience, yourself included, my argument doesn't make any sense. But if you put yourself in the shoes of someone who is not tech savvy, who asked you for advice, right. If they asked you, okay, how do I pirate movies? What would you say?
It's kind of a mess these days. That is an answer I've given relatively recently.
I don't feel like setting it up for you.
Yeah, pretty much.
So when people
go buy the Blu-rays,
when people say HDCP doesn't work anyway, they're right. It doesn't prevent anyone from ripping the content and hosting it on file sharing sites, and it doesn't
a layer of Swiss cheese.
But it is absolutely a friction point. And is it a friction point that creates an enormous amount of collateral damage that personally I'm not really okay with? Yeah. But do I understand why they're doing it and why they continue to do it? Yeah, it's not moon logic. It's not like they're just dumb people doing dumb things. And I think that sometimes if we allow ourselves to just think everyone is dumb but me, we miss the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that it is effective. It's not 100% effective, but it is something.
It definitely is to a certain degree. Yeah.
With all of that said, f*** off and let AMD implement HDMI 2.1 on Linux, because Linux shouldn't have a disadvantage because of your DRM.
Yeah.
So that's what the whole thing boils down to for me.